Hello to my online learners. Today we are going to look at blood and look at the components of it and the function of it, and then how it's formed, how it clots, stuff like that. As we go through, actually let's just pull up the reading guide first. So we're going to look at the components of blood, the formation of blood, the importance of hemoglobin, diagnostic tests, just briefly. The life cycle of a red blood cell, briefly, but more so you understand what they are. Stopping of bleeding, coagulation, clotting, blood types, and transfusion. So a lot of information. And as we go through it, I would like you to start with a Word document or some sort of document where as we go through it, you can summarize it. So we're summarizing the components of blood. The plasma, the red blood cells, the white blood cells, and the platelets. Those are the main components of blood. Notice I use the word components because really red blood cells and platelets aren't cells. So often they're referred to as blood elements. And I'll talk more about that when we get to that point. Okay, so this way you can summarize the information as we present it. Good. Let's look at the textbook. Now, in the textbook, it says that the average human adult has 5 liters of blood. First off, just a little thing that you might be curious, you might not. If you look at liters, it has an ER ending. That is the American spelling. If it's an RE ending, that is the Canadian spelling. So it's just, you know, kind of like color and color. So 5 liters of jug, 5 liters of blood. So if you think of a big milk jug, that's 4 liters. And then you've got a little milk jug. So 5 liters of blood, and that same 5 liters of blood keeps going over and over and over through your body. Okay? Good. Good. Now, when you look at blood, initially the blood was considered the fluid of life, and they didn't quite understand it until they looked at under the microscope. And then under the microscope, they saw that there were blood cells. And from there, we came to realize it is a connective tissue. So there's several types of cells, and there is a fluid. Okay? And it is the blood that goes endlessly through and through. And it delivers oxygen, it removes waste. Main part of your cell, main part of your blood function, sorry. It delivers nutrients, hormones, enzymes, and other critical substances, and it plays multiple roles in prevention against infection, stabilizing acid-base balance, and regulates your body temperature. So if you look at 4 functions of your blood, you've got delivers oxygen and removes waste, and delivers nutrients. So it's a delivery system. It protects the body from infection, acid-base balance, and also body temperature regulation. Okay? Now, the reason why taking a blood sample is very easy, it's also a good way to detect disease and disorders, and it's very, very simple to do, so that's why it can be done. Now, when we look at the components of the blood, this diagram is a little confusing, so let me break it down. When we look at the components of the blood, first off, before we get started, if you haven't, as we go through, I want you to have your component, a little table to summarize. You got your components, your description, and your function, and we're going to break it down into plasma and our cells, or actually our blood elements. They're not true cells. Okay? So that's what we're going to do as we go through. Now, in this diagram, it's a little confusing, so let me clarify a bit. This is a spun sample, or a sample that has been centrifuged. Now, when you centrifuge it, you separate things based on weight. If you remember, blood can be a suspension, which means when you spin it down, the blood cells go to the bottom and they're heavier, and these are the red blood cells. What I want you to realize is there's 3 parts to your blood. There's the plasma, which is this part here is the plasma, and then there is the buffy coat. Now, the buffy coat is right here, and it is part of the formed elements. That was It's part of the formed elements. So although this red line goes here, it should actually go up here because the formed elements are in the buffy coat. So when you separate the blood into, it's kind of separated into two parts, the plasma and the formed elements. But when you look at the centrifuge bit, there's this white bit in between, which is called the buffy coat. And the buffy coat is the layer underneath the plasma. And this is only 1%, but this is where your your white blood cells and your platelets are formed. So in the bottom are your erythrocytes. So this is kind of a confusing setup in terms of describing it. What I want you to realize is there are 3 parts to your blood. The first part is your plasma. 3 parts to your spun blood. First part's your plasma. Second part is the buffy coat, where the white blood cells and the platelets are. And then the third part is down at the bottom, and this is where your erythrocytes or your red blood cells are. So this is kind of a little confusing because your formed elements include your buffy coat. Okay, so that bracket is wrong. Good. So when you look at your plasma is clear extracellular matrix, and this is 55% of your blood. This is where the main proteins are, okay? And the main one being albumin. And albumin is basically this great big protein that stays in your blood. It can be used for nutrients if it really needs to, but it's more there for osmotic or what's called oncotic pressure. And there's other proteins, electrolytes, hormones, gases. Most things are dissolved in your plasma. And this is where your clotting proteins are. And if you were to remove the solid part, you have serum. So serum is just the fluid. Plasma is the whole part. Okay, now let's take a second and summarize. So our component is plasma. What is it? 55% of your blood. And it is, so it's mainly water. But it also has the hormones, clotting factors, electrolytes. Okay. Electrolytes. Good. Now, if you take away the plasma, so plasma, and then if you go minus cells, minus cells isn't the right word, minus proteins. Proteins is serum. Okay? Good. So the plasma without the clotting factors is the serum. So quite often if you're giving a blood transfusion or if you're donating blood, sometimes they'll just take your serum, and you don't want to take your clotting factors because you don't want to clot the other person's blood. Now, in the plasma, the main function is transport. Okay? There are some gases in the plasma too, but realize gases don't dissolve well in warm liquids, so very limited amount of gases. Your carbon dioxide and your oxygen actually have to go other ways, because just like warm pop doesn't stay bubbly, warm blood, which is even usually warmer than pop, doesn't dissolve gases well. So that is your serum. Now, let's look at, since we're looking at the buffy coat, let's briefly write down white blood cells here. So this is found in the buffy coat. Okay, and 1%. Very small, but very important. Now, this is why it's normally 1%, but if there is any infection or any reason why the white blood cell count rises, you have an increase in your buffy coat. So this is why it's very obvious when you do a spin down that your white blood cell count is up. Okay, so in most diseases, your white blood cell count will go up, but in some, like AIDS, it will go down. So any change in your white blood cell numbers shows that there's a concern there. Okay, and then your platelets are also found in buffy coat. Okay, good. So the red blood cells are the heaviest of the formed elements. They sink to the bottom and they take up, let's get the exact number here, 45%. So red blood cells are 45% of your blood. And let's also write down the scientific words. So red cells are erythrocytes. So cytes means cells, erythro means red, leuco means white. And we might as well do it now, but we'll get to later the others, thrombocytes. And if you know that thrombosis is a clot or a clotting condition, so thrombo is a clot word, okay? So far from this first panel, we've got our percentages. We've talked a little about plasma, but we haven't talked very much about the red and the white blood cells now, but that's okay. We'll summarize their function later. Good. Now, what I want you to realize is that you must have proper viscosity. Your blood needs to be at a certain concentration to move. So if you think of viscosity, viscosity is sort of like thickness, such as honey is thicker than water. So the honey is more viscous than water. The whole blood is moving and it must be, and it's thicker than water. So quite often they talk about blood thinners becoming less viscous, but that will happen if you have more blood volume. If your blood gets too thick, you will have it slow down, and then you can have clotting, or it changes the viscosity or the speed of it. So there can be a problem there. Now, all blood cells are formed in bone marrow and they're actually formed quite quickly. So there's a very detailed diagram, but first off, let's look at it. The body, it continually replaces red blood cells that are old and damaged that have been used up. This is called poiesis, okay? So, oops, what have I got things here? Go away. Hemo has to do with blood. And this is usually done in the red bone marrow. If you remember, the red bone marrow is found in your long bones, your irregular bones, such as your sternum, your cranium, your vertebrae, and your pelvis. And yeah, as you get older, your red bone marrow decreases. Your lymphatic system will also store them or modify them. They don't create them. They're created in the red bones and your red bone marrow. So lymphatic system, blood cells can be stored in your lymph nodes, your spleen, and also your thymus gland. Okay? Now, when you look at it, you normally have 400 billion platelets, so they're very small, 200 billion red blood cells, and 20 billion white blood cells, and that is being replaced every single day. So on a cellular level, you're very active. And this is why it's very important that you keep healthy and with healthy blood cells, healthy bones. Now, without going into too much detail, I want you to realize it's complicated, but I also want you to realize that all blood cells come from a stem cell, and a stem cell is unspecialized cells in your bone marrow. Then, depending on what chemical messages or hormones you get, it'll make it go into a different pathway. So when you look at the pathway, let's get rid of that. Okay. When you look at the pathway, notice that they have word parts in them. So let's go down to the bottom first. One pathway will form erythrocytes. Then there are two different pathways for the white blood cells, whether you're a granulocyte or an agranulocyte. And then the last one is for platelets or thrombocytes. So they come from a big cell. So let's look at, I don't want you to know all these words, but I do want you to realize that a red blood cell goes through a bunch of stages. And yeah, there's a lot of stages. And the last stage in the formation of your red blood cell is to remove most of your organelles, including your nucleus. So since the nucleus is gone, it has no genetic information. So red blood cells cannot reproduce themselves. So they need to be made in the bone marrow, and then they don't change. So red blood cells are very important, but they're really just carriers. They don't do much other than carry. Very important as carriers because they carry the oxygen, but otherwise they're just big boats. The thing that's interesting with the white blood cells is they have this great big nucleus in them, and the different types of nucleus means that they're active, growing, and moving. So these cells can actually change, and a monocyte with time will actually become a phagocyte, which can change and eat, becomes and eats the different invaders. Okay, we'll look a little more about the different types of cells, white blood cells, in a bit. But notice that, again, lots of stages, and they all come from the similar thing. Then there's a lymphoblast, which becomes a lymphocyte, and these ones are more in your lymph nodes, and then the monoblast becomes the monocyte, and the monocyte is very good at cleaning up scavengers. When we look at the thrombocyte, it comes from a megakaryoblast. So mega means large, karyo means cell, and blast means creator. So it's the large cell creator, and then it makes the megakaryote, which then breaks down into thrombocytes. So thrombocytes are not really cells because they're just pieces of the megakaryocyte. And then the discussion about erythrocytes, because at the end they lose their nucleus, they're not really cells either because they don't have the ability to create their own, to divide. Okay, so this is complicated, and I really just want you to appreciate the complexity of the development of blood cells, but they all come from the stem cells in the bone marrow. Okay, let's look at them in a little more detail. First off, the red blood cell. The red blood cell's job, or the erythrocyte, is to carry oxygen in hemoglobin. And it does carry a small amount of carbon dioxide attached to the outside of the hemoglobin, but it doesn't have a specific spot for the hemoglobin, or for the oxygen. Okay, so hemoglobin is this fancy molecule where oxygen fits right into it and is attracted to it and carried around. Carbon dioxide is kind of attracted to the outside. Now, as the cell loses its organelles in development, it gets this indented shape, which is very important for its flexibility. And also now it has a very large surface area. So because it has a large surface area, it's very efficient for transporting oxygen in and out. Okay, so stop for a second and fill out your, let's finish a little bit more on red blood cells. So on the red blood cell, it also talks about the cytoskeleton, making it very stretchy. And it's important that it's very stretchy and flexible because it has to go through the tiny capillaries. The magic molecule in red blood cells is hemoglobin. And hemoglobin, so if you were to magnify it, there are millions. I think there's a lot. Let's just say a lot. I don't know the exact number, but there's a lot of hemoglobin inside the red blood cell. And that's, the heme is the iron which gives it its red pigment. So these green blobs are iron. Because of this iron, you have an attraction to oxygen, and the oxygen will then interact with the iron, making oxyhemoglobin. Okay, so the iron is where the oxygen forms, and then here it says the carbon dioxide binds to the globin. So the globin is the bigger red squirrelies. And it basically binds that oxygen. Remember how we talk about oxygen will hold its electrons tight and become slightly negative. So it will bind to any hydrogens that had slightly positives on them. And that's how the hemoglobin and carbon dioxide interact. And we'll go into a little more detail on that. There we go. Each red blood cell has 200 to 300 million molecules of hemoglobin. And because the hemoglobin is being attracted to the oxygen, it will keep the oxygen concentration at a gradient. So this way, when oxygen comes into the lungs and encounters the hemoglobin, it will always be attracted to the hemoglobin, and it will keep the concentration gradient going. Okay? So let's summarize our red blood cells. So our red blood cells, the description, have no nucleus. As the nucleus is put out at the end, they're called biconcave discs. Concave discs, or they're kind of like dented in the middle. And the function, to carry oxygen. Okay. Now, depending on what program I'm using, please realize the 2 should be down below. It is a subscript 2, showing that there's 2 molecules of oxygen. I can't put that some places in Blackboard, but please get in the habit of putting it in if you can. And then it also carries carbon dioxide, but not specifically. So it carries carries oxygen to the iron of hemoglobin. Okay, and it's attached to the iron of the hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide is attracted to the globin. Okay. Good. So, yes, both are carried by the hemoglobin, but hemoglobin is specifically for oxygen, and the carbon dioxide just kind of tags along. Okay. Very important for oxygen carrying. You may want to put hemoglobin in here. Now, hemoglobin is abbreviated HB just because hemoglobin's a big word, and good old biologists love to make a big word and then abbreviate it. So if you put the abbreviation in here, and then we can use it later. So that is the main function of the red blood cells. The red blood cells is the most common blood element. It's not a true cell because the nucleus has been kicked out at the end. Okay? Good. When we are looking at taking samples or any tests, one of them is the hematocrit. And you don't need to know what the percentages are. They do change. But what a hematocrit is it spins down the cells so it looks in a little glass tube, not in a, you wouldn't take a whole test tube of it. But you can tell normally if you have a large amount of plasma, you can tell mainly your blood cell count, or you can tell how much white blood cells you have. So it's kind of the percentage gives you an indicator of what's going on. Good. Okay, now it looks like my video might cut out in 25 minutes, so we'll see how it goes. Let's see if I cut out. Okay. So that is the red blood cell. Very important. Hemoglobin is important because hemoglobin is the iron pigment that carries the oxygen. If your hemoglobin levels are down, that means either you're destroying your white blood cells, your red blood cells too fast, or you're not making them. And often it's related to the fact that you don't have enough iron in your body. And then your red blood cell count, again, determines how healthy your blood is. Okay? There's a little difference between male and female. You don't have to look at that in too much detail. Good. My video is going to time out here, so let's stop at the red blood cells and We'll look at the life cycle of the red blood cell in the next video.